Good evening, everybody. I'd like to ask you to find a seat. And thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Terry Gerton. I'm the president of the National Academy of Public Administration. And on behalf of the entire Academy, I want to say how pleased we are to be the home of the Elliot Richardson Prize. And I love this event. It's wonderful to see so many people, friends of Mr. Richardson, friends of the Academy, and fans of good government. So we're really thrilled to have you all here tonight. Of course, Elliot Richardson personified public service. He served in 4 cabinet-level positions in the United States government, including the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, and the Secretary of Commerce. Of course, Mr. Richardson was also a fellow of the National Academy, and we wholeheartedly embrace the values of integrity and public service that his life and this award represent. Tonight, we're here to recognize Governor Edmund Brown for continuing the tradition of Elliot Richardson through his excellence, integrity, and dedication to our government, the people of our nation, and the people of California. Tonight's event is the result of many months of work and planning, and so I want to acknowledge the efforts and support of the board of the Elliot Richardson Prize Fund, the prize nominating committee, and the board of the National Academy of Public Administration, all of whom play an important role in preserving this legacy. We'll begin this evening with Mr. J.T. Smith, a member of the Richardson Board and the co-chair of the Richardson Nominating Committee and an honorary Academy Fellow, who will give remarks and a tribute to Mr. Richardson. Mr. Smith will be followed by Mr. Tim Clark, also a member of the Nominating Committee and Academy Fellow and Editor-at-Large for Government Executive, who will introduce our prize winner. And following these tributes, Mr. Michael Rogers, chairman of the Richardson Board, will award the Richardson Prize to our honoree. In addition to the award of the Richardson Prize this evening, I will have the honor of inducting Governor Brown as an honorary fellow of the Academy. Our program will then follow, and we are pleased to have tonight's conversation led by Mr. Francis Rose. Following the discussion, there will be a question and answer session, and we'd like to encourage your participation. We will have roving microphones, so we ask that you raise your hand, wait to be called upon, and then wait for the mic to arrive before you start to ask your question. So with that, I would like to thank you all for coming, and I'll turn the event over to Mr. J.T. Smith.
The purpose of the prize we award to Governor Brown tonight is to honor the memory and example of Elliot Richardson, a dedicated, principled, and exceptional public servant. It is difficult for me to believe that Elliot, who was a friend and mentor, has been dead for 20 years. He died on New Year's Eve, 1999, on the verge of a new millennium. His example has loomed large in recent months. People knowing of my relationship with Elliot ask me, what would he think about the events of the current period? And others, including a law professor friend, asked, where is Elliot Richardson when we need him? While I commiserate with these acquaintances, I also note that Richardson cared about and thought about many matters and not just constitutional crises. Prominent among them was the enduring importance of career public service, a topic which I will emphasize in just a couple minutes tonight. Even though Richardson's greatest notoriety and fame came about in the Saturday Night Massacre, so-called, he often remarked that he wanted to be remembered for different reasons, including his long involvement in public policy and administration at the state, national, and international level. Indeed, before the Saturday Night Massacre, he had landed at Normandy, served in his 30s as an assistant secretary of HEW, then as United States Attorney for Massachusetts, Attorney General and Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, and as Undersecretary of State. He then served in 3 of the 4 cabinet posts mentioned in the program between his 3rd and 4th cabinet positions. And in this period, he was ambassador to Great Britain. And later, in his favorite job, 4 years in the Carter administration, he served as the head of the U.S. delegation to the UN Law of the Sea negotiations. Drawing upon these many experiences, in his final book entitled Reflections of a Radical Moderate, Richardson devotes a chapter to career public service and recounts the work of the National Commission on Public Service chaired by Paul Volcker, one of our Richardson Prize winners. Richardson describes his admiration for such legendary public servants as Rufus Miles and Bob Ball. And I had the privilege of knowing Bob Ball when he was the formidable head of the Social Security Administration. Richardson had the highest regard for these exceptional career officers of the United States government and for the many exceptional Foreign Service officers with whom he worked in his State Department jobs. He often would give talks to students, and he was always on the lookout to recruit more public servants. And he would say that they should know that government employees at any different level are engaged in tasks of greater social impact and importance than those at counterpart levels in business. Many of the Volcker Commission's and Richardson's prescriptions for strengthening and preserving career civil service remain pertinent today. Moreover, they are a vital part of the mission of the National Academy of Public Administration. I can attest that in each of his 4 cabinet posts, Richardson delighted in working with career public servants, and he viewed them as a vital element in his successful administration of those departments. He would have been chagrined, frankly, by the current trend to characterize such public servants as part of a deep state dedicated to the agenda of defeating responsible political leadership. Richardson appreciated that the career public service was a vital underpinning of effective governance. He reasoned that our nation needs to entrust public servants with tasks that concern us in common, but we cannot do ourselves. He characterized this mutual understanding between the broader populace and public servants as the foundation, and I quote, of our unique and precious form of government. And he recognized that career public servants in partnership with strong political leaders, such as Governor Brown, who appreciate their experience and competence, can accomplish great things. I would now like to turn the podium over to my friend Tim Clark, who will introduce Governor Brown. Tim, as mentioned, is a former officer of NAPA, a longtime chronicler of government, and a perfect person to introduce the governor. Thank you.
Perfection is a hard thing to attain. JT, I want to start by citing an omission in your presentation, which is that your real connection to Governor Brown, and one of them is that your wife, Mary Tidings, voted for him in his first run for the presidency in the state of Maryland, which he won in 1976. I nominated Governor Brown for this honor, and so I'm here to say a few words about why he deserves it. And I can't think of a better person, someone who's been in the arena for so long, trying so hard over so many years to do good for the public. Simply put, few can match his energetic commitment to serving the public, in the arena for a lifetime, as Teddy Roosevelt might have put it. And few can match the intellectual journey that inspired that service. As a young man, Jerry Brown spent 3.5 years in a Jesuit seminary studying. And after 2 years, he took a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And he undertook a course of study in the classics, studying Cicero, Virgil, Socrates, and more. He embraced the Jesuit idea of thinking about the future while acting in the present. And the motto, the Jesuit motto, I think it is, age quod agis, do what you are doing. 3 years in these years imbued him with the frugality and the humility that would shape his approach to life and to government in succeeding years. He displayed his frugality in his very first elected job in government as a member of the Los Angeles County new charter school board, or I guess it was a new community college board of trustees. Much to the irritation of his fellow trustees, I'm sure, he firmly opposed their quest to spend $700 each on new furnishings for their office. Soon, Jerry decided to seek statewide office as California's Secretary of State. He had an ascetic style of campaigning. He did not hug people or kiss babies. He rarely smiled, writes his biographer Miriam Paul in her new book, The Browns of California. And that was a departure, by the way, from his father's style of campaigning. He rejected big campaign donations, calling dependence on money from lobbyists and special interests inherently corrupting. And once elected, he promoted and crafted Proposition 9, which limited spending on statewide races and required full disclosures of donations. Then, at age 36, he was elected governor, beating San Francisco Mayor Joe Alioto and others in the Democratic primary. He was the youngest governor youngest man elected to that office since the Civil War. Jerry canceled plans for an inaugural ball. He wouldn't move into the new big governor's mansion, 20,000 square feet, instead sleeping on a mattress in a $250 a month apartment. He mothballed the state limousine and drove himself around in his plain old Plymouth sedan. He disdained small talk and sought relaxation at a Zen center and a Trappist monastery in Northern California. He quickly earned a reputation as a fiscal conservative. Facing large deficits, his first budget laid out 3 core principles. 1, government should not spend more than it takes in. 2, larger expenditures do not equate to better government. And 3, there are no sacred cows. His view of government's potential seemed limited. Asked about his objectives 6 months into his term, he said, quote, reduce the sum of human misery a bit, I guess. Help people expand their lives a little bit. Give them an awareness of their own potential. Governor Brown backed Cesar Chavez's campaign to make California the first state to grant basic labor rights to farm workers. He embraced environmental goals, citing the philosopher Thorstein Veblen's critique of conspicuous consumption. He went after air pollution and was ahead of his time in proposing carpool lanes on the freeways. He created the first rooftop solar tax incentives. By 1 vote, he prevailed in creating the powerful Coastal Commission to regulate the use of the state's precious coastline. After his second term had ended, he ran for the Senate in 1982, but lost to Pete Wilson. He would quote Nietzsche, "What fails to destroy me will only make me stronger." Jerry went abroad to refresh his soul. In Japan, he studied Buddhism, whose tenets echoed those of Jesuit teachings. In India, he visited Mother Teresa and worked in one of her hospices in Calcutta. But politics still called, and in 1988, he returned to run for and win the chairmanship of the state Democratic Party in California. In 1991, he decided to make another run for the White House. He'd long believed he would make a good president, and this was his third try. He had run against Jimmy Carter in 1976 and might have won the nomination then, but for his late start. He may quarrel with that. He challenged Carter again in 1980, and in 1992, he innovated with a toll-free telephone line for contributions that he limited to only $100 per donor. But he couldn't catch Bill Clinton. Jerry moved to Oakland and built a commune with 13 bedrooms and 9 baths, and created a radio show whose guests were leading intellectuals of the times. But restless on the sidelines, he ran for mayor, and he served 2 terms. Among his pledges was to revitalize the downtown of Old Oakland. And he bet that by pursuing what he called elegant density, he could attract 10,000 new residents, and the plan succeeded. He embraced the idea of charter schools, one of which, the Oakland Military Academy, adopted the Jesuit motto, Age quod agis, do what you are doing. And he was married for the first time at age 67 to the accomplished Ann Gust, 20 years his junior. She must have seen in him the youthful spirit and first-class intellect that had attracted Natalie Wood and Linda Ronstadt in days gone by. Jerry wanted to rise up the ladder again. In 2006, he was elected Attorney General of California, assuming a post that had catapulted his father, Pat Brown, to the governorship years before. In office, he defended his state's right to enforce strict auto emissions standards against federal attack. And he won a settlement against Countrywide Financial, the huge mortgage scam artist that helped precipitate the Great Recession. At age 72, he filed to run for governor again. He would compare himself to Cincinnatus, the Roman dictator called out of retirement to save the republic in 39 BC. He left behind much of the old small is beautiful mantra and adopted his father ideal, government as a force for good, a protector of people in perilous times. In the recession, California faced huge budget deficits and a credit rating that was the worst in the nation. But Jerry pushed through Proposition 30 to increase taxes to shore up the budget and fund the schools. He took blame for pursuing harsh sentencing guidance during his first term as governor and worked to reduce the prison population. The state adopted an earned income tax credit and expanded Medi-Cal to help its neediest residents. California became the first sanctuary state, and the governor stood up to Attorney General Jeff Sessions when Jeff Sessions sued. The state passed a bill that has allowed 1 million undocumented immigrants to obtain driver's license, and it passed a bill committing to 100% renewable energy goal by 2045. And the state became the nation's de facto leader on climate change. Jerry and Kevin de Leon, the leader of the state Senate, played a prominent diplomatic role at international climate meetings in Paris and in Rome in 2015 and 2016. De Leon spent the last few years as president of the Senate, negotiating with Jerry 2.0, pushing him to be more like the liberal Jerry 1.0 of yesteryear. De Leon told me about how the meetings would go. You could always tell that Jerry didn't like your idea. If he started to come on with all this mumbo-jumbo about Jesuit philosophy and Socrates and the Peloponnesian Wars, he'd filibuster until his secretary would arrive to announce he was late for another meeting. Saying no, however one might do it, is at the core of political leadership, and our honoree is surely not lacking in that. People often hate introductions of themselves, but I hope our guest will abide by one principle he has espoused, to wit, humani nihil a me alienum puto. Thank you very much.
Well done, Tim Clark. Thank you very much for that introduction of our honoree this evening. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Richardson Prize Fund Board, we're very pleased to see all of you. This is the 6th time that the Richardson Prize has been awarded by NAPA since the transfer from the Center for Excellence in Government, and we are delighted to have this. I want to thank the Board of Directors and the nominating committee for your great work over the years, and for this year, producing an honoree who is, in fact, the only honoree who is solely from state and local government. All of our other honorees have come from the federal side, and one of the benefits here is that Governor Brown spent his career in California and not in Washington. So we're very delighted to that has occurred. In this past year, or since our last award ceremony, we've lost several honorees. I'd ask you to join me in just a moment of silence, recognizing the contributions of honorees Alice Rivlin, Williams Ruckelshaus, and Paul Volcker, who all passed in 2019. Just a moment. Thank you very much. Okay, here we go. You know, the Richardson Prize is a generous prize. It comes with it not only the recognition, but a cash prize of $50,000. And the Prize Fund Board has a policy that we've exercised with each award, that the awardee gets the $50,000, but we ask for a commitment to donate half of it to your favorite charity. And we hope you will consider that. And as chairman of the Prize Fund Board and a NAPA fellow, I also must say that NAPA is a very good charity to consider. So now, Governor Edmund G. Brown, will you join me on the stage? Let me read this. In the arena for a lifetime, Jerry Brown has been both the youngest and the oldest governor of our largest state, serving 4 terms, the last ending in 2019. A budget disciplinarian when needed, he also was a consistent advocate for immigrants and the poor. He has been an innovator in addressing California's environmental problems and its water supply challenges. Never content on the sidelines, he successfully ran to become chairman of the Democratic Party in California, to serve as the state's Attorney General, and for election as mayor of Oakland, whose downtown he rejuvenated. In further evidence of his commitment to public service, he ran but lost 2 contests for U.S. Senate and also mounted 3 unsuccessful bids for the Democratic presidential nomination. Highly educated, cerebral, and energetically devoted to the public interest over a half-century, Jerry Brown is an exemplar of the virtues celebrated by the Elliot Richardson Prize for Excellence in Public Service. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Please.
Here, Terry will.
Do I sit down?
Yes, I'll turn you over to her.
Okay, good. Yes.
Present you with our honorary first.
Okay, good.
And although it doesn't come with any cash award, I am honored to induct you, sir, as an Honorary Fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration.
Thank you. All right, thank you.
Yes. And Francis, if you would come up. You've heard a lot about Governor Brown. I'll just quickly introduce you to Francis Rose, an award-winning broadcaster, journalist, speaker, and writer, and the host of certain people in Washington, D.C.'s favorite TV show, Gov Matters, on Washington, D.C. is WJLA ABC 7. Thank you, Francis.
Terry, thank you very much. It's delightful to be able to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. You're a pro, Governor. That's wonderful. Half the time, we get on stage and we start talking, and the water sits there and does nothing. And since you and I have 4 hours to cover tonight, no, not 4 hours, 3 hours. Okay, great. One of the things I love about this job in this city, Governor, is that all kinds of interesting paths come together. We're sitting here in a building tonight that is named after the man who served as governor of California between your father and you. And I wonder, when you think about things like that as you reflect on your career, the thousands of people that you've interacted with personally, the millions of people whose work you have impacted in all the levels in which you served, when you think about things like that, what goes through your mind?
Well, if you're asking me, what do I think about when I hear the name Ronald Reagan?
Well, no, that wasn't exactly what I had in mind, but sure.
No, tell me what. Well, I don't think I followed your question.
I just think it's...
Would you reframe your question?
Sure.
You want me to think
so we're
about,
off to a flying start,
no,
Governor.
All right. Look,
It's my fault,
my
too.
father's governor,
Yes.
Reagan's governor, I'm
And then
governor.
you're governor.
Now, what can I draw from that?
Well, and that's I guess, kind of the question, is that you have been in so many important places and done so many important things in your life, and you've interacted with so many important people. I imagine you were part of the process when your father transitioned to Governor Reagan, and of course you interacted with Governor Reagan when you took over in Sacramento, and you've crossed paths with so many people like that. And I just wonder if those kinds of interactions register when, I'm sure at some point you looked over this agenda and said, okay, I'm going to the Reagan building a month from now, or tonight, or at some point. I just wonder if those kinds of things resonate with you on any level, and if so, what comes to your mind?
Well, you've said you don't want me to talk about Reagan.
No,
So
I said you didn't have
So I can
to.
talk about myself or my father. That's the only two left.
All right, fair enough.
But, so what does that mean? There's one inference that I could point to, that Ronald Reagan beat my father by about 18 points, which was a huge win, given the fact that California was 57% Democrat. Now, he was elected, and 4 years later, I was elected Secretary of State at the very time he was elected to his second term. So you might ask, how could that happen? Because a lot of my thrust was that my name was Edmund G. Brown, Jr., related to my father, Edmund G. Brown, although he was called Pat and I was called Jerry, but that people got the idea. And I would say, and this isn't public administration, this is campaign analysis, that one of the keys to being elected is you have to be somebody. My father told me at a very young age, you don't beat somebody with nobody. All right, because my father was governor 4 years before, even though he was defeated, still the name was in the public mind for many, many years. He was Attorney General and then governor. So by having his name, I already had a major thrust, and that's why I beat Joe Alioto, who was more eloquent, maybe smarter for all I know, richer, more experienced, but I still beat him 2-1. And a lot of that is because of the aura, the name recognition, the thrust, the loyalty that people, Reagan and my father got 90% plus of the African American vote, okay? When I came, I did the same thing. It was almost transferred. So there was a certain political legacy that I inherited, even though I was a different person, it's a different time. So that is all I can say between Pat Brown, Ronald Reagan, and myself. That is a connection that I make, and I'll make a second connection. California has been a state that is capable of a range of political responses. It could elect a Pat Brown, but then elected a Ronald Reagan. Then it could elect me. And then it could elect a very conservative governor named George Deukmejian. And then a while after that, it elects a movie actor. The other point, which you didn't ask me, but I'm going to tell you, both times I ran for governor, in '74 and in 2010, I replaced a actor, Republican incumbent governor. So, I mean, I'm just trying to draw out the factors here that are implicated by this not overly fruitful factoid that it's Brown to Reagan to Brown Jr.
I accept your rebuke as
But
a badge of honor.
no, it's not a rebuke.
Governor.
But I will go on to say something about Reagan. Reagan ran a good campaign. I saw him the first time at the opening of the Los Angeles Music Center. That Mrs. Chandler, who was the wife of the owner of the Los Angeles Times, was a big fundraiser and sponsor for. So we walk into the founder's room, and in walks this guy, Ronald Reagan, who I'd seen, I think, in the movies, or maybe I saw him in an Arrow shirt ad, I don't know where, but I recognized his face. This was a year before the campaign, and he was impeccably dressed. His shirt was well pressed, his suit, his haircut, his standing. This man knew how to present himself, and that was not insignificant in his presentation, because he not only looked good, he knew how to talk, and more importantly for a politician, he knew how to pause. He knew how to react. He was not a motor mouth politician talking about everything. He knew how, the timing. He was quite good in his campaigning. And so I noticed that. So I both observed my father, but I also observed the campaign and how Ronald Reagan functioned, and I was right there in Sacramento for the last 4 years of his administration. So that was an influence. I don't know that he was a man who he'd say, cut, trim, and squeeze. That's what he talked about government spending, which was not my program. I came at frugality maybe slightly differently. I was born in 1938. My parents were married in the Depression. There was a different vibe. We didn't have credit cards. We went out to restaurants maybe twice in a year. It was a much more restricted set of possibilities that confronted one growing up in the 40s during World War II, rationing, and no building going on, no new private cars, not a lot of toys and things. If you go into a grocery store, it doesn't look like going into a grocery store today with thousands and tens of thousands of what they call SKUs, different items. So I would just say that I noticed my father and I noticed Reagan. And I want to say something about my father. He often would use the phrase, there's a moral absolute. And I think of that expression, and I compare that to the postmodernist thought of the utter fluidity of reality and how people see principles as there's no foundation, and it's a very different kind of world we're in. I do think the level of cynicism, of manipulation that is endemic to the press, endemic to the political process, endemic to the campaign consultants, is a different world. I'm not saying the politicians weren't scoundrels at times, but there is a qualitative difference in the foundational premises of how the political world interprets reality. And that, I think, makes for a very different world and makes for an undermining of the dignity and the perceived importance of public service. That respect for public service becomes more difficult. We're in the age that we're in, where for whatever reason, the foundations are eroding in churches, in institutions, and so the public service gets caught up in that. And so I think Elliot Richardson and what he stands for and your organization, it's more important than ever. And I have to say, just sitting in this room listening, I contrast it with, well, I won't say when, but I was in a meeting of several political reporters, and the tone is completely different. The world of the press looking at the world is completely diametrically different than the presentation I heard from the speakers that preceded me.
Governor, thank you very much for that insight. And also I want to thank Tim for that really terrific introduction of Governor Brown and insight in his life. And I'm fortunate when I do these things, I get to learn about really interesting people who've...
And his father was in the McCarthy campaign.
Yeah.
And I first met him in 1967.
So you know everybody, it seems. I mean, I imagine that happens to you all the time.
I have run into many people.
Yes. One of the things that I thought was fascinating about your introduction, Tim, is you mentioned some ideas that the governor has championed, especially some of the things that you pointed out during his first term as governor, carpool lanes and all the environmental things and so on, that we now think of as just the way of the world. These are natural things that seem like no-brainers to us today. That was happening about the same time that people were referring to you as Governor Moonbeam and thought that these ideas were way out there. How did you go about winning support for ideas that didn't seem like they were mainstream at the time, but that you and your colleagues knew were important to the future of the state?
That's definitely one of the monikers that is associated with me, Moonbeam. So I have to say something about that, because you're asking me how did we see these non-conventional ideas. But Moonbeam in part comes from my impatience with the mundane, the quondam, what you're supposed to do. And I always was interested in something over the hill, over the horizon. One of the reasons I left the world, as we called it at that time, and entered the Jesuits, I found the world not interesting and empty as a young college student. I said, where is this all going? So I wanted to go to a spiritual place, the Sacred Heart Novitiate, which was totally isolated, which we spoke Latin, silence most of the time. We had no newspapers, no secular books. And so I think my, I don't know if it's impatience, boredom, with a lot of things that normal people like, didn't interest me that much. So the environment, I think, has an analog to the theological. Theology is about fundamental things, about God, creation. Environment is about the rules of the world. Even the word ecology, it comes from two Greek words, eco and logos. Logos is also the word for the second person of the Blessed Trinity, logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The word there is translated from the Greek Bible as logos. So when you have eco, that's our household, and then you have logos, you have the study of our house being the atmosphere, the world, the earth, the oceans, the land, the fishes, the vegetation, and all that. So I was attracted to the environment because of there's an absolute quality. You can't argue with the environment. It is what it is. You can abuse it, but over time, the environment always wins. And any creature that attacks its environment attacks itself and ultimately is extinguished. So it seemed to me, struck me as profoundly important and worthy of investigating, of studying, of thinking about. So that's how I got interested in the environment. And and I wasn't always interested in the environment, but in 1972, there was the World Environmental Summit in Stockholm. That was the beginning of, I think, the global environmental consciousness. I think Earth Day, I believe, was 1970. So these were times when the environment was coming to the fore. And I remember reading an article, I think it was in Foreign Affairs, and I've tried to find it, but I couldn't. But it just had a sentence about the thinness of the soil that we stand on. The soil is relatively thin, and the atmosphere above is also relatively thin. And so that struck me as a certain, it struck me as a certain fragility. In truth, it's not fragile. We're fragile. But it does bring home the reality that it isn't just, we're sitting in the chair in this building and everything's in its place. It only is in its place if we treat it properly and if we have proper reverence for the rules of our larger house called ecology. So that's how I got interested in it, and I began to look to meet people who were similarly interested, and that's how the environment, because so many things in politics are ephemeral. We have an issue today, it's going today, another one tomorrow, another one after that. There's a lot of fads in government, even though the programs always new, like in education, every 4 or 5 years they got a new reform and a new thing that's going to solve everything. And that's true in a lot of things. They use labels. They name things. A lot of these bills are given names, and they name the reality that they want to create. But instead of creating the reality, they just get a name. And they use that name, and then they use it for a while. It doesn't do that much, and they go into another name. So when you talk about the environment, you're talking about the real. This is not arbitrary. It's not a name. It is what we are. And that's why the environment always interested me more than the more mundane political issues that you must focus on if you want to get elected. Because if you talk too much, then you don't get anywhere. By the way, the other thing about Moonbeam, I wanted to I had an astronaut in my administration, Rusty Schweikart from Apollo 9, and he suggested we build a satellite, and they launched it out of the space shuttle that was just being launched at that time. And we could have had a SYNCOM-4 satellite with a footprint of just California, and it could be used for emergency communication, for government communication, which would have done what some of the cell phone and communications capacity technology does now. But that was the idea, and I got that idea, well, from the astronaut. But when I would fly from Los Angeles, where I lived, to Sacramento, the governor's office, I always noticed when people get off in Sacramento, they all had these briefcases, and there was lots of people, and all the time, all these bodies, and all these briefcases, and all these chopped trees turned into paper were moving around. I thought, maybe we could just send messages, and we wouldn't have to send all these people, pay all that money, and create all that pollution. We could just send messages up to the satellite. Satellite sends down the messages. Well, now today we can do that, but in 1978, that wasn't the reality. So that Moonbeam because of the satellite, Moonbeam because I'm not quite grounded in the normal politics. And so when I talk, people say, where is he coming from? There's something a little strange here. And so that made Moonbeam feel like the right metaphor for describing me. So, even though the man who said it, Mike Royko, took it back. He recanted after some months.
So that context then that you offer is especially interesting. Again, referring back to what Tim was talking about, reading about your career to prepare for tonight. The word that came to mind as I listened to Tim's description was one that I thought of yesterday looking over your career, and that's resilience. And I go to that great political reference, Wikipedia, with this, which I think is fascinating. In 1995, in the motion picture, 1995, note the date, In the motion picture Jade, the fictional governor of California tells an assistant district attorney to drop a case, quote, unless you want as much of a future in this state as Jerry Brown. The assistant DA responds, who's Jerry Brown? Now that's before you became
Mayor of Oakland.
Mayor of Oakland, Attorney General of the state of
And
California, and two-term governor.
Yes.
What do you think that says about your desire to serve people and the resilience that you demonstrated in not only having the desire to serve, but convincing two electorates, local and statewide, that you were the right person to serve them again?
Well, I would look back to my great-grandfather, August Schuckman, born in 1827. It's in that book, The Browns of California. He left Hamburg, Germany in 1849. We have the bill of the ship manifest. And the name of the ship was Perseverance. And he came on this sailing ship and came to New York and worked on the Great Lakes. And finally, on the covered wagon, got out to California in 1852. And he went up to, eventually got to Colusa County, where he took over a stagecoach stop, an inn, because he wanted to be an innkeeper. And his 8th child was my grandmother, Ida. And Ida's firstborn son was my father. So I feel there's a certain perseverance. That's a very important word. And when I was in the 8th grade, I remember Sister Alice Joseph writing on the board, perseverance, 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 perseverance. So it worked. I remember, you got to persevere. I also think St. Paul said somewhere, he who perseveres will be saved. That's another way to pick that up. One of the things we had to do in the seminary is read the New Testament several times, which I did, because we had no choice.
And you didn't have any other books to read while you were there?
We didn't, no.
You had nothing else?
We only read Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ, the New Testament, a book by the Jesuit Alphonsus Rodriguez on ascetical practice, very boring, very dry. And then we could read the lives of Jesuit saints. But with permission, we could read the lives of a Dominican or a Franciscan saint.
Oh, wow.
But that's it, for 2 years. So anyway, resilience. I want to introduce another term here, because you're all public servants. But I entered politics. And politics is driven by ambition. And certainly, I wanted to be governor, and I went about doing it. And then after I lost to Pete Wilson, I said, in my last statement, I said, and I will return, kind of thoughts of General MacArthur or something. I did say that. It's a little headline, which I have from the Los Angeles Times. I didn't know how I was going to get there, but I was going to do something. So I worked my way back after spending went to Mexico, lived in a village there for a few months. And anyway, so I came back and I was going to run for mayor of Los Angeles, because I thought that was a good stepping stone. So you have to understand, this is not all about serving people. There's a lot of serving oneself. This is a self-serving enterprise here, or one can't put up with it. You would not spend all your time begging for money, trying to look good, kissing babies and smiling. I mean, that's not my idea of an enlightened existence. But it's what I chose, because I found it rewarding and exciting. You cannot minimize the thrill. I know people don't tell you that. Why do you run for governor? I have to say, it's exciting. And I will tell you how it all started. I was studying for the bar exam in the governor's mansion in March of '65. And my father was in his 3rd term, going to his 2nd term. And the next election, that would have been his 3rd term, was '66. And the Speaker of the California Assembly, Jess Unruh, it's called Big Daddy. He was a major political force, extremely bright, came up from a hardscrabble life in Texas. And he worked his way up after getting out of the Army through USC to being an assemblyman and then the Speaker. Well, he wanted to run for governor. And my father said, no, Jess, the people need me. Because this is one of the things you think you're needed. Whether you are or not, that's another question. But they were discussing this, and I'd been reading the law, and I found it extremely boring, studying for the bar. What? I didn't hear you.
He said you didn't pass the bar.
No, I didn't pass the bar. No, this is my second try.
I just want to point out, by the way, Governor, that Tim suggested that and not me.
Well, no, that's fine.
I didn't remind you of that.
Actually, I think there were 5 guys from Yale Law School and 3 funked the California bar. So at Yale, we didn't bother ourselves with mere laws, mere codes. We were looking at the legal process. I studied Roman law. I studied psychiatry in the law with Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna Freud. This is what
Did you pass the Roman bar?
I got an A in Roman law. That is true.
Excellent.
By a great Roman scholar that had nothing to do with the California bar.
Oh.
Procedure, community property, evidence. No, that was not our forte. Anyway, I was studying for the bar and falling asleep because I found it so boring. But I heard this argument, and I came down from the 3rd floor and sat on the steps, and I could see Unra and my father talking in the living room, and they were arguing about, oh, I want to run. No, I'm going to run, my turn, whatever. And just listening, my heart started pounding. I said, this is what I want to do. I want to run for governor. So that's when I decided. And I then passed the bar, clerked on the Supreme Court of California, then moved to LA because that was the biggest media market and where most of the donors resided. And I moved in 66. In 67, I joined the McCarthy campaign. 69, I ran for junior college board. 70, I ran for Secretary of State. Then I was governor. So I moved quickly. Then I had a slight hiatus before I came back again. But yeah, resilience, ambition, compulsion, a hankering after exciting experiences. I mean, you might say, why do you run for president? It's fun to run for president, particularly if you're 38. It's interesting because then all of a sudden you get briefings from generals. I remember going to Harvard and getting a briefing from Thomas Schelling, and we're talking about the military budget. I remember him saying, well, even if we put 25% of the budget or the GDP, we can still handle it. And I met a lot of different, so you learn a lot. It's kind of a practical PhD in government, in politics, in the issues. Yes, public service, vision, idealism, principle, but there's also the kind of the lower instincts of desire and ambition and reaching and overreaching.
If there were not people, though, that had that ambition, then we wouldn't have people who were able to drive change the way that you've drove change throughout your career. We heard earlier about the fact that Richardson Prize recipients historically are people who work at the federal level. That process, I imagine, the times that you ran for president, you took a lot of time personally and heard from a lot of people also about how governing would potentially be different if you came to Washington as president than it was when you were governor of California. What did you consider as the possible differences in how you would actually execute on an agenda?
Well, if I want to, frankly, I don't think I had any idea how the federal government worked. I'm not even sure I was interested.
You just wanted to be president.
I wanted to be president. I was interested in avoiding nuclear war and
good goal.
Space exploration. I was interested in the big stuff. Don't sweat the small stuff.
Okay.
It's not that interesting.
You'd have
by the way,
you'd have all these people for that.
But I want to bring you down a little bit to the low level of politics, which is a high calling but a low profession. I remember asking Allard Lowenstein. He was one of the leaders in the Dump Johnson campaign that ultimately morphed into McCarthy, and then he went over to Kennedy. But he was advising me in 1976, after the Kennedy-McCarthy campaign. Anyway, I asked him, I said, Al, what about this Middle East? How do we, the Palestinians, the Israelis, what the hell's the answer to all that? And he said, good footwork. Good footwork, okay. In other words, when they asked you that, dance. Don't, now that's the opposite of Elizabeth Warren. What's the answer? I got a plan. Well, I was given other advice. Good footwork. Because when you get to the general election, you want to leave as few footprints as possible from the primary. Because what you need to do to get the primary is not what you need to get to the general. And that's just kind of politics. That's presidential politics 101.
You talked before about the difference that you see in the media as to how they approach governing and people who govern. And one of the concerns that NAPA addresses on an ongoing basis, I talk about it on my program, and you actually mentioned it earlier, I believe, too. We're going to need more people to come and do these jobs. We're going to need to continue to perpetuate the civil service, and for that matter, the people who want to run for office to be able to oversee those things. What do you think the things that you did as mayor, attorney general, the other positions, governor, other positions in your career, were the most effective at generating the next generation of people to serve, either in politics or in civil service, public service?
What would be the most effective? Well, I'd say for me, since I have a good test case, being governor from 1975 to 1983, that was an 8-year period, in the same office, same institution, and then coming back in 2011, doing the same thing in the same office for 8 more years. So I have a bank of memories and thoughts about what does the chief of staff do? What does the legislative secretary or legislative leader for the governor do? What about the appointment secretary? What about the appointment of judges? What is the relationship between the governor's office and the different departments and agencies? I would say this is a change. Experience counts. You learn things. Now you need the young, the exuberant, the risk-taking, but you need the leavening of experience and wisdom that only comes from a life lived where you do things, you make mistakes, you reflect, you learn, and you go on. And so I think you need the combination of the energetic, young, new entrants into the public service, but you need the continuity, which sometimes these early retirements or the disenchantment with government makes impossible. I mean, there are not many people being governor between the ages of 72 and 81. And I found that more interesting than being between 36 when I retired at 44.
Why so?
Well, because I knew, first of all, the first time I was younger than the legislature, and they knew a lot. Some maybe they knew more. Then the second time I was older, and I knew more than they did. And they gave me a little respect. You know, what's that guy said? Give me some respect.
Oh, Rodney Dangerfield got no respect.
Yeah. Well, I didn't get
guy.
much respect, but I don't know that I could earn any respect at that point. It was a little bit anomalous to be elected at my age. And a lot of it was because of my father, and a lot of it's luck. Remember, this was 74. That was a Nixon impeachment. That was Watergate. The Republican brand had been weakened. And so that politics is timing, and a lot of it is luck. For example, this last time around, I was very successful. One of the key drivers of my success was the fact that the California economy, during the time I was governor, increased from 2.1 trillion to 2.9 trillion. That's about 100 billion more of spendable money for the people of California for every year that I was governor. And I had absolutely nothing to do with that. So, again,
You have retired from politics, obviously.
I didn't interfere with it. So we're lifted by external forces and structure. You know, you find the world, you have to take the world as it is and work within it. And so there's a lot of luck. But I will say, I wanted to say something about public service. When I was first elected as governor in 1974, I hired two guys. One won the $64,000 question. Was a young guy, very bright. And then another guy, Ed Hamilton, was a consultant, worked with New York City. And I made them my consultants. And then I started working on the budget. It was about a 2 or 3 week exercise, 8 to 12 hours a day, going over the entire California budget with each finance specialist from all the various departments. But the tradition is always, one of the most important appointments is the governor brings his finance man in. And usually they're a political person that they know. I didn't do that. The two civil servants, a guy named Ed Beach and Roy Bell, they were the finance leaders under my father. And they were the finance leaders under Ronald Reagan. And so I said, hey, if they're good enough for that, why should I put someone in between me and that experience? And that's what I did. And so I found the civil servants, the people who, there's something, this guy Ed Beach, he really knew the system. If you wanted to get around the civil service rules, he would show you how to do it. And because we wanted to hire some people in the exam and all that other stuff, he knew how to do it within the rules. Perfectly perfect. Then other people that I bring in, kind of not so, different people that I appointed to different jobs, and they would start putting people in, they didn't know how to do it. And then it'd be a big scandal and an audit, and everything went wrong. And from that, I got a real appreciation for the old hand. Whenever I want to do it, and that's why I brought, the second time around, I wanted mostly people who'd been there a long time. And if there's going to be any creative ideas or disruption or whatever, I'll take care of that. But I want the people who know what the hell they're doing so that they will help me and prevent me from doing stupid things. Because politics, in the most part, is just everybody talking, and the press, and they're all gabbing. But underneath it, people have to do things. And there's a lot of rules. And very few people know what the hell is going on. I can tell you that. And there's another sad part that I didn't realize. With the term limits, the legislators don't know very much. They don't. And increasingly, whether it's workers' comp, whether it's a forest tax, whether it's a water bond, whether it's a rainy day fund to save money, whatever it is, it's all staff in the executive branch. And you used to have long-time consultants, but a lot of that's gone. And the legislators themselves, almost nothing. There's very little initiative coming out of what's supposed to be the people's branch. And they're totally dependent on their consultants, their experts, and they're totally dependent on the governor. So the governor has a lot of, not the governor, but the governor's people, which is the long-time public servants. And that's the crucial importance of, and I'm sure it's the same way. I don't think there's anything different between the state of California with a $220 billion budget in the federal government. I mean, one's multiplied by 10, but still the same thing. You have the political who are just talking in cliches and political talk. And then there's the reality that you got to make things happen. So there's always that tension. And I would bet a state as big as California has some of the same, that thing I would say in the climate change. We're the most advanced climate action ever. We're it in the Western Hemisphere. Not as much as we need to do, but far more than anybody else. Now, how did that happen? It happened, now we're going to talk about the structure. Smog in Los Angeles. Haze, your eyes hurting. So when Ronald Reagan's governor, people in LA, what about all this smog? We got to get rid of it. Okay, so he does the Clean Air Board. At the same time, Nixon passed the Clean Air Act, and after, I think, second year of Nixon, or third, they put in an exception. California can make stricter vehicle emission standards than the federal government. That became the waiver, the California waiver, and we've exercised it dozens and dozens of times. But that's Ronald Reagan. We're talking 1969, 1970, 1971, and Richard Nixon. So Republicans, state and federal, and fast forward, I became governor right after Reagan. I implemented a lot of this stuff. And then we have all these other governors. We have 4 more governors. But they kept building up the California Air Resources Board. So in this institution, we have more people who work on climate science than EPA. We have and by the way, the chairwoman of the California Air Resources Board, which regulates climate and other pollutants, is a woman named Mary Nichols, who I appointed in 1976. And then Arnold appointed her. So we have a lot of continuity. My director of health services, which is a $100 billion budget, if you count the federal money, Diana Dooley, I hired her for the governor's office when she was 26. She's now in her 60s. So that's continuity, and underneath the continuity, you have civil servants who are there for their lives. And that is a very important, the respect and the maintenance of that is crucial to our governance. I think it's similar in the big states, and you can't just recreate that. So you can run around and say, let's do this on air, let's reduce carbon emissions. You need technicians, lawyers, policy people, as well as the political support. But if you don't have people know what they're doing, you can't have it done. And you can't know what you're doing unless you do it for decades. That's how you get to know it. Well, you can't do that unless you have a permanent cadre of people who feel it's worth doing that. And that's why you have to have real honor for the people who are part of this work of public service.
Governor, that's a terrific statement. I apologize if I caught you off guard with my comment about you've obviously retired from politics. The reason I say that is because you talked about the economic expansion and then said I had nothing to do with it. And if you were still active in politics, you would have figured out some way to take credit for it.
No, I discerned early on, taking credit is a fool's errand. What is the key fact of politics? People don't believe what politicians say. So why waste your time taking credit and patting yourself on the back? They're more inclined to believe if you say, that guy's a bum, my opponent. It's easier to attack than it is to puff yourself up. I mean, that's just the way it is. So I admit that. I did, well, just taking the classic formulation, Machiavelli and the prince. What does the prince need? Fortuna and virtus. Virtu. Fortuna is luck, good fortune. Virtu is skill. You need skill and you need luck. Well, that was the way it was in the 15th century. It's the way it is today. So the fortuna is what you don't control. And that's what you have to be aware of that. But then you want to use your skill as much as possible. But I think we're building for the future in fiscal solvency, in building the high-speed rail, in reducing carbon emissions, in encouraging renewable energy, in funding lower-income school districts by a different kind of educational formula, by having early parole and giving people hope and a sense of possible redemption instead of just being locked up with no hope for 50 years. So, yes, we can do things, but you need the favorable winds at your back to really accomplish things and to have people think you did a good job. Because when the economy goes south, they blame you. I always thought it was so significant. People blame the mayor for jobs. This mayor, unemployment is 10%. How come? Governor, even the president, even the Federal Reserve can't. Alan Greenspan was called the Oracle. He couldn't stop the collapse in 2008, 2009, so he didn't know either. So there's we're very sophisticated. We have a lot of modern knowledge. We got artificial intelligence and quantitative computing and all the rest of the quantum computing, but there's still plenty of unknown. We are in uncharted waters, particularly with carbon emissions and with a lot of the other things we're doing. So we need a little humility in the face of complexity. We
have questions from the audience, and we'll get there in 1 minute. I have one more, and there'll be microphones coming around. You mentioned 08, 09. We haven't talked about your service as Attorney General yet. I'm not going to have time to ask you what I wanted to ask you about that, unless you can stay till about 10, which I'm not going to ask you.
I can ask you a quick about that. My wife was the senior counsel. Now, most people say, don't have the wife at the office, right? Well, I had the wife at the office, and it worked perfectly. Now, of course, she didn't get paid, so I didn't make the Wolfowitz error, which is
A little shot
you don't
there,
put
Governor.
your
That's-
you don't put your woman on the payroll.
Yes.
That's not legal. In fact, I met him in an elevator once. I said, Wolfowitz, she could have done this. She should have done it for free, pro bono. Then everything would have been fine. Anyway, I'm going to tell this is not. So my wife, Ann, was a fabulous lawyer. I was on the law review at Michigan, much smarter than me. And so she became the senior counsel, and she had been an executive at the Gap. She knew how to manage an office. She knew how to manage lawyers. And the lawyers of the Attorney General's office, they loved having Ann as the advisor and manager. They didn't want my chaotic approach, whatever you want to call it, because I'm more unpredictable. But Ann knows how to manage. It's clear, she's direct. You plan your work, you work your plan, so that worked. Now, what I want to say something about her. The consumer department of the Attorney General was going around with all this little stuff. You know, people advertise tires or motel rooms, and they weren't exactly what they were, and they go after consumer fraud or advertising, false advertising. And we had this countrywide and all this mortgage deception, and they weren't doing anything. They said, well, so she actually got rid of two of the key people in the Consumer Affairs Department, promoted other people from up, and we finally got into court against Countrywide. Maybe we got the conviction, but we got into Countrywide. No, we got into Countrywide one day before before Bank of America, or before Countrywide Bank of America bought it, and they were a federal agency, so California would have lost their jurisdiction. But because we got the case finally in court, because my wife Ann, we withstood the statute of limitations and were able to sue Countrywide and ultimately get a significant judgment against it. So you do need the outsider, but you also need the professional, and it's that combination that can make government really work.
I just am so grateful for your indulging my questions tonight, Governor, and we have time for folks from the audience. And where's the microphone people? All right.
By
so
the way,
this-
did you
Yes, sir.
feel I indulged your questions or I answered them?
Oh, you answered them wonderfully, but I mean,
I just wasn't quite sure whether indulging your questions. I always thought
No, what I was-
answering your question was
no,
was
you,
what the
you hit a
goal.
home run. I hope that my questions weren't so pedestrian that they were kind of a pain to deal with, Governor.
Well, they were pedestrian,
All right.
but they were right to the point. What else are we supposed to talk about?
That's what I'm here for.
This is meat and potatoes, right?
That's what Terry told me. She said,
public
get to
service.
the point and let the governor speak. And that's what I tried to do. Gentlemen, you're first. Microphone's coming. Tell us who you are and who you're with, and then answer the question. It was on.
Hi, I'm a federal employee, but I've been dying for years to ask you, would you ever considered being a running mate? I'm specifically thinking in 2016, if in the summer, if Mrs. Clinton had offered you to run with her, and if you had believed that it would make a huge difference in the outcome. I've read generally that you don't have chemistry with the Clintons necessarily, but let's just say you really believed that running with Mrs. Clinton would be sort of the institutional backbone that she needed, the independence, the name brand. Would you have considered it?
That's the understatement of the evening, isn't it?
Yeah, well, what's understated?
The chemistry with the Clintons.
Oh, right. Well, I get along with, among politicians, they understand each other. But I don't think I could have helped Hillary. I don't, maybe Lyndon Johnson got Texas for Kennedy, or maybe they stole it for Kennedy. I don't know, maybe that was Chicago. But the vice presidents, that's the whole story. How much could you make it? And the president, it's so overwhelming in the advertising and the focus. I don't know how much vice president could do. I don't know how much I could do. I can tell you the Clintons would not have that. Look, I'm from California. Washington barely knows there's Californians out there. You people You people are already having lunch when we're just getting to the office. So we're in a different world, and California is marginal to the scene. So I'm very glad you brought me here because it's completely deviant to the norm of Washington. And I don't think that is a plausible scenario that you outlined.
Thank you for the question. Right here in the front. Ma'am, we'll come to you next.
My name is Ewan Ho. I'm also a federal employee. My question has to do with the high-speed rail that you were a big proponent of. So obviously the Republicans in California and the Trump administration has ridiculed that for being the train to nowhere. And your successor, Governor Newsom, has talked about scaling it back or modifying the high-speed rail. I just want to get your opinion on that.
Lilliputian minds. China, and I'm not trying to say anything more about China, good, bad, or indifferent, but China has 15,000 miles of high-speed rail. 15,000 miles. California has 139 miles. I mean, we've built 139 miles. We have a long way to go. We want to build it from the north to the south. The first thing we want to get connected is Silicon Valley, San Jose, to Fresno, Merced, Bakersfield, so people can move quickly between the lower cost housing to the astronomically cost housing. But high-speed, and by the way, high-speed rail in California will run on 100% renewable energy. So it definitely has global warming implications. There's something about big projects. You know, I think, I don't know, it was Disraeli or somebody wanted to build the Panama Canal, said it's impossible. There was great fear of building the Panama Canal. Even the Golden Gate Bridge, there was great skepticism. About the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, BART, people said, the mayor of Berkeley said, this is a joke or something. There's something about what is new. Maybe that's where the moonbeam comes from. If it isn't the kind of garden variety issue, it's hard for the new in our democratic system. And it's becoming harder for America. There's a certain exhaustion setting in. And we, for example, we like to blame, the Chinese. Do you know that they're spending hundreds of billions on battery research and 5G research and medical research? They're spending more than we are now. And that's a subsidy. And we're going to tariff them for that. Well, another might be, why don't we spend money? Why don't we invest in infrastructure, in our people, in all these different technologies that are needed for the future? So there's a certain pulling in, and that, I think, explains the high-speed rail. They can't, and first of all, half the people are for it, half the people are against it. And if the cost, if we're at 3 trillion GDP, and you build a high-speed rail, it's going to last 100 years. It's going to be paid back, not the capital outlay, but the operating can be paid out from the fare box. And it competes with planes, because by the time you get into your plane in LA and you get to the airport, that's going to take you about an hour. Then you get on the plane, that's an hour. Then you get into San Francisco and you got more traffic. You get on a high-speed rail, it takes you down there in 3.5 hours. It's very competitive, as you find out in Spain. I think between Barcelona and wherever, Madrid, I'm not sure, but they're very successful. There's 12 countries that do that. So I think high-speed rail is important, but I also think R&D is important. Nuclear that isn't a proliferation risk or doesn't have waste. We have to invest more, and they can't. To increase the gas tax is unthinkable in Washington, in this Congress, right? Well, California increases gas tax 12 cents and increased diesel by 20, and the Republicans put it on the ballot as a referendum to knock it out. And the people voted for it by 13%, or maybe it's 10%. So the people did ratify it because we were able to show what we're building, and they didn't want to stop building. So we can build, but we got to do more than borrow. And the political will to invest in ourselves is the #1 factor in our global position. Not, yes, China is subsidizing things. They're making a lot of things, but there's a lot more we could do if we invest in our own. America was leading in solar photovoltaic cells, and the Chinese started driving the price down. Well, that wasn't fair exactly, but all of a sudden the price is a lot lower, and California has 35% of its current electricity from renewables. So I think we need a positive industrial policy. We need that connection between government and business that can really be effective. And I don't think we need a dictatorship to get there. We've seen that in our past.
I think you got one. I think you got one more race left in you, Governor. I think it's a question right here, and I'm afraid, unfortunately, ma'am, you're going to be the last one. We're almost out of time.
Elizabeth Keller with the International City County Management Association, and I was working in the city of Sunnyvale during your first term of governor. We had a ballot measure on nuclear plants and whether we wanted to continue to build them in California. You touched on this in your last comment, but I'm curious to see what your thinking is about nuclear power as part of our climate solution.
All right, yeah, there was a ballot measure to basically shut down nuclear power. I did not support that, but I did support 3 bills that required that no new nuclear plants could be built unless there was a certified method of permanent waste disposal, which does not exist yet. The federal government has not certified a permanent disposal site. They're still fighting over Arizona, whether Nevada, and it's still quite a hassle. So nuclear definitely is zero emission once you get it built, and there's a lot to be said for it. But the current configuration of light water reactors and the ability to reprocess and enrich uranium is a serious proliferation risk, as we see with Iran. Once you can build the infrastructure to build and maintain a nuclear reactor, you also are developing the skills to build enriched uranium from which you can then build bombs. So that's its number one danger, is proliferation. Number two, there again, this waste, this radioactive waste has to be maintained for tens of thousands of years. And what kind of a government are we going to have in 1,000 years? Who's supposed to do that? Say, stay out, nuclear waste below or something? So you got the waste disposal. You also have the threat of terrorism. If a terrorist wants to go hit a nuclear plant and blow it up, you spread all that radioactive waste, it's all on site. So that's bad. And the fourth point is that there's reactor mistake, Chernobyl in Japan, at 3 Mile Island. So it's good until it's not good. And so there is that inherent low risk but high consequence. What we should be doing, and which people are doing, is investing in a new generation of standardized nuclear reactors that will not have the waste problem and continue to work on hydrogen. So that's good, but we're not there yet. We're probably 10 years away. So I think we need, whatever we need significantly higher research and commitment by the federal government, which does not exist. We could spend how many hundreds of billions a year on corporate tax reduction, half of which went for, what do you call them, buybacks, stock buybacks, dividends. I don't know. So we're in a very serious problem. The political climate cannot allow paying for what everybody wants. So we borrow. We're borrowing $1 trillion this year to keep our budget going, even though we're at the peak of the recovery. And the absolute first principle of this Keynesian economics is you spend in the recession when the unemployment rate is high and the slack in the economy is great. Right now, the unemployment is 3.5, and the slack, there's not much. So we got it all wrong. We should be building a surplus, but we can't build a surplus because we can't pay for what people think we need. And there's a lot of things that the Congress thinks we need, which we don't need, which is a brand new nuclear system for $1 trillion over the next 30 years. So we both have to be more frugal, but we also have to be more expansive. And we have to, and that takes a lot of wisdom. How do you invest in what you need and don't waste money on what you don't? Well, that's where our politics is really challenged. And so it's going to take a lot of good public servants, but it's going to take a few enlightened politicians and a shaping of the public debate at a higher level than it exists today. And today, I'm afraid it's the horse race, the amount of intellectual energy that is devoted to trying to figure out who will win the Iowa caucus. It's enormous. I mean, you could probably invent a number of things that we all need with the amount of brain power that is devoted to Ouija board activity. Who's going to win? It's prophecy by secularists. It makes no sense. But it's not about, you can't talk about the issues. You talk about a tweet, you can talk about a retweet from Trump. You can talk about, what did Bernie say? Did he say a woman can't win? Or did Warren say? All this stuff. But compared to what is coming at us, it's pathetic. And we really need a wake-up call to get to where we need to be and to get our country back on track.
I'm tremendously grateful, Terry, for you inviting me. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
It's wonderful.
All right, well, Governor Brown and Mr. Rose, thank you so much for really a riveting conversation over the last hour. And I personally appreciate both your time and your candor with us tonight. I think we've been left with some really important things to think about as we go forward. So will you please join, I know you just sat down, but I'm going to ask you one more time. Please join me in another round of applause for Governor Brown. That does conclude the formal portion of our program this evening. Right back outside where you enjoyed some appetizer snacks. We do have some dessert. We hope you'll stick around for some additional conversation and fellowship. Thank you very much.